So Deadpool and Wolverine came out this past weekend, and I'm really excited to finally go see it this upcoming weekend, but I decided that I needed to finally go through and watch the X-Men movies that I hadn't seen. Now, I have seen most of them. I've seen X-Men, X2, The Last Stand, Origins, The Wolverine, Logan, Deadpool 1 and 2. Also, with the young cast, I've seen First Class and Apocalypse and Days of Future Past. Not in that order, I know that's not the right order. But I hadn't seen Dark Phoenix and another one, The New Mutants. But today I'm going to be talking about the Dark Phoenix because I finally went ahead and watched it last night. And it was surprisingly good. In my experience, what happened with the Dark Phoenix was it came out, I didn't hear anything really good about it, and then it kind of just went away. Now, I never really heard anything super negative about it, just kind of that people didn't really care for it. And I think that might have played a big role in why I enjoyed it as much as I did. Just this lack of conversation about this movie, no one really caring for it, people just being indifferent. But I am glad that I finally went ahead and watched it because I had a good time. This movie is not a perfect movie by any means. It definitely has its flaws in writing and other areas, but I think it has some other things going for it as well. So let's talk about those things. Just going based on the order of the notes that I took while watching this movie, I think I'm gonna start off with a few more negative things about this movie, some critiques and criticisms, not only of the movie itself, but also of just the characters and the story, because this isn't the first time that we've met these characters and it's not the beginning of the story. I am not a big fan of the amount of criticism that is given towards Charles Xavier in this movie. I know that the X-Men movies have gone on a long time and Charles has been in a lot of movies, and he is not a perfect man by any means, but he is a good man with a good heart, and he always has been. He's always tried to do the right thing, regardless of how anyone else sees it. And I just don't appreciate how everyone seems to think that Charles is, someone to just throw blame at. Because every single one of the X-Men in at least one of the movies has made a mistake. I definitely understand some of the frustrations that Hank has with Charles. Hank has known Charles a long time, and even if I don't agree with his frustrations and his blame of Charles in certain situations, I definitely can understand where he's coming from. But what I will say is Mystique is one of the last people that needs to be acting high and mighty, and she definitely does in this movie. She blames Charles for a lot, and are we forgetting all that you've done? Because I haven't. She just seems to be really frustrated with Charles in this movie over, his relations with the government and how they're putting their lives on the line to help regular people, non-mutants. And to a degree, I get it, but at the same time, Mystique, you are not being held captive. You are free to leave if you want to. And to be honest with you, the X-Men have fought for mutants and humans alike since First Class, chronologically, so this is nothing new, really. It is kind of weird to see Charles being such a public figure, respected amongst humans, but at the same time, this is what we fought for. This peace, this alliance, this agreement, this friendship with humanity, this is a good thing. So you being frustrated over this is kind of petty. And I know you feel like you aren't living your own life because you're part of the X-Men and you're taking big risks and you feel like they're not worth it. Well, again, you are free to leave. You are not being held captive. You could even probably just stay in the mansion and not go on missions. And I'm sure as much as Charles might not like that, he's not gonna kick you out for it. And as far as the whole going out of your way to save humans, risking your lives to save humans and not necessarily just mutants, I know you don't have an Uncle Ben, but that factors into the whole with great power comes great responsibility. It's the right thing to do. So while I do get where she's coming from, not living her own life and living Charles's dream and not her own, it does come off a little bit selfish. But also it's just weird to see someone acting high and mighty after last movie, chronologically for you, we had to fix a problem that you helped create through time. And then let's not also forget that you left Charles on the beach right after he had been shot and paralyzed by the man that you left him for. So I like the character of Mystique, but at the same time, let's not act like you're perfect. You're throwing around blame to everybody else, but you've done far worse in your life. And I guess speaking of Mystique, she dies in this movie? Now I know that this movie doesn't get mentioned very much, no one ever talks about it, but at the same time, how have I not been spoiled on that? This movie's been out for a while, years now, and I just never saw a spoiler, I never heard a spoiler, nothing. That's kind of crazy. I was surprised by that. And I'm gonna wait till later to talk about the villain of this movie, the alien species or whatever, but isn't it so weird that our shape-shifting mutant dies before we meet the shape-shifting aliens in the same movie? And just, it's unrelated. Just our mutant that has that power dies before we meet the enemy that has that power. Let's talk about Jean. After all, she is the central character of this movie. I wrote down that I felt worse for Jean in The Last Stand than I did for her in Dark Phoenix. But what I will say is I don't know if that's necessarily true, because by the end of the movie, I did feel pretty bad for her. We didn't go super deep with the Phoenix Force and what it is and what it does in this movie, but I am glad that we took a step up and a step forward from The Last Stand. Everything is kind of still super vague about it. It's not super explained in the movie, but we did get to go a little bit more in depth. And with the movie being called Dark Phoenix, I'm glad that that was the focal point of the story. And we have Magneto as just a supporting character in this movie, because that's the one thing that Last Stand didn't do, because Magneto was still the main villain, and then we had Jean just there, kind of. It was nice that we got to see a little bit more of Charles and Jean's relationship and how that began and how that impacts modern day. But unfortunately, that's where a lot of this Charles criticism from the movie stems from, because of what he did to her, blocking off her mind and altering some of her memories so that she could have a happy childhood and a happy life. Unfortunately for everyone who criticized Charles, I get it. Like, I don't think he was in the wrong. He clearly did what he did from a good place, and he did what he did with love, and it was never any malicious design or malicious goal. It was always just for Jean. And that's kind of where, to a degree, I can see both sides. I see Hank and why he thinks what he thinks, but also I get what Charles was meaning to do and what he tried to do. And I can't fault him for that, honestly. He did what he thought was right at the time. And even though we kind of have that conflict throughout the movie with different characters being on different sides, thinking different things, I'm glad that in the end, everyone finally realized that Charles, you know, he did his best. He did what he could do and nothing more or less. And like Mystique, Jean apparently dies in this movie. Now, that's again, not super clear if she's actually dead or not, but I mean, one can assume. I personally kind of felt like she died in this movie, but at the same time, I can't just say that she does, because last time we saw her die without Wolverine's claws through her, she wasn't actually dead. I thought this movie ended in kind of an interesting way, a way that we never really see on screen the X-Men look, and that is with Charles Xavier retired, Hank running the school, you know, Jean's dead, Mystique's dead. It's kind of just a weird situation that everyone falls into after what we see these characters as and where they are in all the movies prior. And I think part of the reason why it feels strange to me is that this is technically before the first 3 X-Men movies and after Days of Future Past. So at this point, the timeline is kind of just whatever they wanted it to be. And so in that respect, it doesn't feel quite right to me, but I just have to remember in the back of my mind that we've rewritten essentially everything that's come before, almost. So anything can really happen. The timeline is open, and all that came before doesn't necessarily have any bearing on what we can do now. Speaking of the ending of this movie and where characters end up, I think that the ending of this movie gave me one of my favorite moments between Charles and Eric. And that's just this genuine friendship moment when Charles is retired and he's just, you know, at a little outdoor cafe and Eric comes to play chess with him. I think that's one of the few times in the X-Men movies as a whole that we see such a genuine friendship moment between the two, especially after they've become villains and are still kind of like frenemies. Because we get a lot of that in First Class where they're just friends, but that's before everything goes down. So it's nice to see why in the original X-Men movies they have this sort of relationship. It's nice to see that shine through. Just a genuine friendship moment with no ulterior motives. I thought it was an interesting choice that they had a lack of Quicksilver in this movie after he was featured so heavily in the previous couple. And I wonder how much of it has to do with Evan Peters being a sought-after actor, that he just didn't have the time and so they wrote him with the smaller role, or if they did that from a story point on purpose, just because with a character like Quicksilver, a speedster, how many problems could just be gone, be settled, just like that. And so I just thought that was interesting that they just didn't have him in there very much. I thought the villains for this movie were interesting. It was definitely a creepy concept to have these aliens that can shapeshift or transform into people, and then also chest twist. I don't even know what that is or what power that is. All I know is twist. That's it. That's what they do. And they're kind of durable, but they can also regenerate, I think, at some capacity, because they were getting shot up with regular guns and they were, just walking that off and healing it a little bit. What I will say is that they aren't super defined. You don't really ever find out what they are. They're kind of just an alien race who's after this power, and that's about it. So in that respect, they're kind of forgettable in the grand scheme of superhero movies and X-Men movies alike, and they're kind of just one-dimensional. There's not really a lot to them. They're just the antagonist. They're the villain. They want this power, and they'll kill people to get it. But there's really not more than that. So in my opinion, they weren't the best villains, but at the same time, it was interesting. And with Jean herself also being the main villain of this movie, kind of, even though it wasn't really her fault and she wasn't trying to hurt her friends or anything, I think you can get away with a lackluster, other villain or other group of villains, because you've already got Jean being the focal point that's taking the audience's attention for the most part. And while I'm talking about the weird alien bad guys, I want to say that I didn't realize until I looked up the cast list that the main one was Jessica Chastain. I was thinking during the movie, wow, they really cast someone who looks kind of creepy, and then I kind of felt bad because it was Jessica Chastain. Now, I also think that X-Men Dark Phoenix was able to do a lot of general movie-making things pretty well. One of those things is the score. I think that getting Hans Zimmer to compose your music and to just work his magic is a great idea. Because after all, Hans Zimmer never misses. The soundtrack plays such a big role in setting the tone or the mood in a scene, so I think why not get someone who's as skilled and talented as Hans Zimmer? It'll definitely cover up some of the imperfections on screen, and at least in my case, the music allowed me to feel more immersed in the story that was being told. Another thing I think this movie has going for it is that the runtime isn't super long. It's under 2 hours, and I think that definitely helps when you're telling a story that isn't quite as compelling as previous installments. It's better to keep your story clean and concise rather than throw a bunch of stuff in there that doesn't need to be. As someone who enjoyed this movie, but not quite as much as the previous installments, I think it was a good idea to have your runtime under 2 hours, because I was able to care about the story without feeling like the story was getting dragged out. The last thing I'll say that this movie definitely had going for it was the visual effects. I think they look super great between X-Men powers and just being in space and everything in between. I think everything looked really good. And that's not really something new. I think that the X-Men movies overall do a really good job with their effects, but I just wanted to point that out because I was thinking about that when I was watching the movie. A couple of scenes here and there, I was like, wow, that looked really good. Overall, I thought this was a pretty decent movie. I would even go so far as to say it was a good movie. I really enjoyed it. I had a good time. It's not the best X-Men movie by a country mile because Logan exists, but it was fun. I had a good time, and that's kind of what you want from a movie. If you've seen X-Men Dark Phoenix, let me know what you thought of it in the comments, because I quite literally have never heard anyone's opinion on this movie. You would even think that it doesn't exist the way that people don't bring it up. But if you made it to the end of the video, thanks for sticking around. If you want to help me out here on YouTube, giving this video a like, commenting, or subscribing to the channel would really help. Even if you want to check out some of the other videos I have on this channel, that would help as well. I'm still trying to grow the channel here on YouTube, so every little bit counts. But until next time, bye.